Thank you, Julie. And Rushanara, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My questions are about fiscal sustainability and austerity. So I'm going to start with Paul. Do you think it matters that we, in practice, haven't had fiscal rules over the last year? And should the Chancellor in the budget statement set out new rules?
In answer to the first question, I don't think it matters that we've not had rules over the last year. I don't think there's any rule that would have been useful under the circumstances that we've faced. Going forward, I think we at the very least need some kind of fiscal framework or long-term fiscal ambition. So we need to know broad terms what the Chancellor is aiming at. I mean, is he aiming at stabilizing the debt over the medium run or reducing the debt over a period of time, or what have you? In terms of specific rules, if you'd asked me that question a few years ago, I would have said, yes, of course, we need some fiscal rules that you lay that out in a bit more detail than I've just said. I'm becoming increasingly cynical, though, about fiscal rules, because they do all seem to end up being ignored in one way or another, either because the world changes or because the Chancellor changes. And we do end up focusing, including, IFS is certainly guilty here, focusing a lot of attention on the specifics of the rules as set out by the Chancellor, because one is judging, they're being judged against the exam that they've themselves set. So I think given that we've got an independent OBR that can monitor whether the broad fiscal direction is consonant with the direction that the Chancellor has set out, then it may be that we're looking for something between not having any fiscal rules at all and having the kind of very specific, let's get debt down by year X, or let's have a balanced budget by year Y. Have something a little bit less specific than that, but quite a lot more than nothing. Now that's not a particularly precise answer, I appreciate, but I do think that a framework in which the Chancellor is clear about the direction he's heading, and, for example, that he broadly wants debt to be falling over a period of time, is appropriate. I'm increasingly cynical about the idea that we want to get to some kind of balanced budget on a cyclically adjusted basis in a certain number of years' time.
Does the rest of the panel share Paul's views? And okay, I'm going to go with Vicky and then Julian.
I did say at the beginning that the fiscal rules have all been abandoned, and there's no much point in worrying about that very much, frankly. But I think the markets will want something. Yep. Because we're going to have to carry on borrowing, and even of course we're going to get a new OBR forecast. Remember, 24-25 we're still going to be borrowing 100 billion pounds, which is hugely more than we've been borrowing for ages, apart from this year. So the markets will still hopefully want to lend that money, and maybe there will be some backing up still from the Bank of England. Now we'll have to wait and see how that develops. But you certainly need to have some sort of show to the markets that you are serious about at least getting back to a position like that. And I think the simpler the rules are, just echoing a little bit what Paul said, the better. This complication that we had before, where you looked at 3 different things, or maybe even more than those, just messes it up in my view. So I'm quite happy to not have anything which is a fiscal rule, but just a fiscal intention.
Particularly your point about interest rates are well made. Julian Jessup, do you want to come in?
Yes, I'm very sympathetic to what both Paul and Vicky have said. I did actually have a look at what the the formal targets are at the moment. And they're a right dog's breakfast of, objectives and mandates and supplementary targets and a welfare cap. And even I, as a professional economist, really struggle to understand what they are. So that's the first failing. You need something that's easy to understand. And you need something that's reasonably robust to shocks. I don't like these targets that seem to specify a particular end date, to balance the budget by a certain point, for example, because we know that things happen all the time that might blow the budget, of course. So equally, though, I think we do need some sort of broad principles to underline the commitment to fiscal discipline. And it might be something like saying that we intend to balance the budget on current spending over the lifetime of a parliament. That would still allow the government to spend, say, 3% of GDP on investment and run an overall deficit of 3% of GDP. But given a reasonable amount of growth in the economy, that's still consistent with debt being flat or falling as a share of GDP. Now, those are reasonably simple principles to understand. But I think we probably do need something like that now, just some sort of broad indication. We don't need to have nailed down all the details of that yet. But I think given that we've got absolutely nothing at all at the moment, but we do have this absolute mountain of debt, I think it would be helpful to signal some sort of idea of what you think the longer term plan would be.
I've got a few more questions. So Torsten, do you want to just say anything that you might disagree on? And then I'm going to move on to the next question.
Well, I can't tell exactly. Maybe I'm going to end up sounding like the kind of Treasury official in the room. But either those things are fiscal rules, like debt falling. If people are really saying we should have no fiscal objectives, fiscal rules, the semantics are the semantics. I think having no anchor is a bigger problem than we think, and I'll give you two really concrete reasons. One is that the function of fiscal policy and targets isn't just about the markets, although I'll come back to the markets. It's actually about being able to operationalize government. It's about being able to control spending day to day in any kind of meaningful way and make trade-offs between spending. If you haven't got an anchor of some form, you are going to find that very hard in practice to do. First thing. The second thing that I think is important is, and goes back to what I was trying to say earlier, which is the fiscal authority is doing your counter-cyclical policy in this world we live in. Yeah, and we don't know how. Let's assume interest rates stay low for a long time. So it makes it easier to do fiscal policy, cheaper, but it means that you need to be very active use of fiscal policy during recessions. And when that's happening, the Bank of England is going to be supporting that in lots of cases, not all, but lots of cases, by buying up your gilts. And if you want to be able to do that without questions starting to be asked about the independence of the Bank of England, fiscal dominance, and the longer term quality of your institutions, which is in the end what matters for your, don't worry about the markets in the short term, what they think about individual things, just focus on what do they think about the quality of British institutions in the medium term. If you don't have a fiscal framework that fits that and fits it with the new world we actually live in, which is the Bank of England buying lots of our gilts during recession so that we can do counter-cyclical policy, that is when you're in a dangerous territory. Okay, well, I'm going to ask my last two questions together, and if you can all come back, because I've got 3 minutes. So the OECD and IMF have warned against a return to austerity, and it's even prompted the FT editorial to declare fiscal orthodoxy has changed. What are the lessons from the response to the 2008 financial crisis and austerity? And what would you be saying to the Chancellor, building on what you don't need to rehearse arguments you've already made, but building on what you've said, what would you be advising the Chancellor to do in this forthcoming budget and going forward? And in particular, if you could speak to youth unemployment, which has a massive scarring effect, where the Kickstart programme was supposed to, by their own targets, help 250,000 people, and only a few thousand young people have benefited. Should the Chancellor put more resources on that, or is it about policy failure and implementation? Torsten, do you want to come in, and then I'm going to go around again? So I think so I agree, there is a kind of consensus around that the consensus on fiscal policy has changed. I think it's important to say what has and hasn't changed. So the academic case against swift austerity and large austerity after a crisis when monetary policy is at the zero lower bound has not changed. It was the same. It was the same consensus back in after 2008-9 as it is today, which is don't do that. It's not a good idea because monetary policy can't offset the impact of your fiscal tightening at the pace that you would require it to be. So you end up with slower growth. So I don't think the academic consensus has changed at all. The policymaker consensus has changed, and you mentioned, Rushanara, the IMF and the OECD in particular. You would say was at the heart of that change, but it's a broader policy, it's a broader consensus change amongst policymakers in central banks and treasuries around the world. I think there are two key drivers of that. One is the lived experience of having just been through 10 years of austerity, which has made the political case for it harder to make and has made the economic case that it supported a fast recovery hard to argue. No one's going to argue that austerity crowded in investment, again, having lived through the 2010s. And the second one is that interest rates have carried on falling. And we have, you know, if you draw a chart of forecasts of interest rates for the last 15 years, they keep showing that everyone expecting them to tick back up in what we call a mañana chart, but they never ever actually go back up, and they've managed to sink again. So I think the fiscal costs of not engaging in austerity have become much lower. And so I think even though the academic position hasn't changed, I think the awareness of how that changes the arithmetic has now got through. And the last thing that has changed that wasn't the case after the financial crisis, because it took us time to work it out, is that what has become, the markets have responded to the emergence of mass quantitative easing in the entire developed world by deciding that sovereign risk doesn't exist for large developed economies. And they didn't think that in 2009, and they did think it by about 2013, 2014.
Right. And youth unemployment, I can go to others if you'd rather not.
It's a massive problem. As Julian rightly said earlier, the age split of job losses is very, very stark, and it's stark in all recessions, but it's much worse.
In terms of, sorry, to probe, what should the Chancellor be doing in March? Should he be introducing new funding, or is it about policy failure?
It's about, we have set too much expectation on the ability of the Kickstart scheme to get volume through, and that was never credible without local authorities driving much more of job creation.
Okay, Julian and Vicky, and then Paul.
Yeah, just very briefly. First, I agree with almost everything that Torsten has just said. I think there is now a consensus against austerity, but I would say austerity, of course, isn't just spending cuts. It can also be tax increases are a form of austerity as well. On youth unemployment, absolutely, I fully understand the concern that people have. Two caveats, though. One is that if I'm right and the economy bounces back quickly, then it may well be young people who are quicker to go back into employment because, you know, they're the people that will be working in hospitality and so on. So it may be the problem solves itself. A second point is that I'm a little bit wary of targeted measures at, for example, young people. It's not obvious to me that you try harder to get a 21-year-old back into work than somebody who might be, say, 27 with family responsibilities. So I think there is a danger that in targeting one group of the population for support, you actually end up penalising other groups. But I fully understand why this is a big concern, because if you're thinking about longer term economic scarring, then losing people who are right at the beginning of their careers, not getting on the jobs ladder, maybe missing out on education opportunities as well, then there might be disproportionate impacts from there. But it's not obvious to me the government needs to do an awful lot more in that area.
Vicky and Paul, very quickly.
Yes, I mean, the interesting thing is I think there has been a shift in thinking, but I'm talking now about academics as well as practitioners. There used to be this great belief that your debt to GDP ratio, if it was above 90%, it was unsustainable. Well, that is no longer the case. Interest rates are so low, and there are recalculations now. Even the European growth and stability, or the Eurozone's growth and stability pact is looked at again. I think there is recognition that there was a mistake in the sense that monetary and fiscal policies didn't work together. Now they do, and they have done, and that has pleased the markets quite considerably. So yes, it is true, as Torsten was saying, that if you've got your own currency and you can print it, obviously you're fine and you're not going to default, and that's what the markets have realized. So if you were to say to the Chancellor what to do now is don't repeat the mistakes of before. Perhaps up to a point they were justified because of the conditions, but even then they were overdone. and the entire environment has changed. In terms of where you spend the money and the youth unemployment issue, very, very important. But as I think was suggested, it's how you do it and how you implement it. And I think increasingly, though, the market will want to see that the money you spend is leading to productive growth in the economy. Because at the end, as we started at the beginning of this session, it's growth that matters. So all these schemes have to get you back to growth. And the young are a very substantial element of that.
Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, on the fiscal consensus, I mean, I think one has to be a little bit careful. I mean, what the IMF and others have very clearly said, and I think there's complete consensus on, as there was broadly in 2008, 2009, is that, in the middle of a recession, don't do a massive tightening. There's clearly a big change in how concerned people are about levels of debt. And I think that reflects an expectation more than anything else that interest rates will remain rock bottom. I mean, the thing that worries me in all of that is that nobody expected interest rates to be this low for a decade, and nobody has any idea when they'll start going up again. And I would really like to double down on what Torsten was saying earlier about the fundamental importance of confidence in our institutions, both political, economic, and financial. Because if we lose that, then with the whole world looking to sell sovereign debt, we don't want to be the new Argentina. I'm not suggesting we're anywhere near that, but I do think that beyond anything, it's confidence in those things that matters. But I would just caution that just because there's a new consensus that interest rates will be zero forever, it's almost certainly going to be wrong at some point. And of course, we are, because of quantitative easing, extremely out on a limb if interest rates do start to rise, because the cost of that is immediately significantly high. I don't have anything terribly wise to add on youth unemployment. I mean, this is an issue that is, you can do things that have an impact in the short run. But that is hard, and it needs well-designed policies that involve not just, as Torsten was saying, central government, but other delivery partners as well. But we need to be thinking about, because this is something we worry about every time there's a recession. I mean, it's the one thing that you can be sure about recessions, is that it is young, people entering the labour market who will struggle. And we certainly saw that in the 1980s and also in 2009, 2010. And I think this is something where we need a longer term response as well, part of which is to do with our technical education apprenticeship, non-university route. Part of it is to do with the way that we think about the university route itself. But one word of optimism is that our youth labour market does work better than quite a lot of other countries in terms of at least getting people into work. It works less well in terms of developing them and ensuring growth in the longer run. And that's what we should be focusing on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rushanara.